The city lights of New York spread out below them like a carpet of fallen stars, a silent, glittering audience to the scene unfolding in the penthouse. Silk sheets, cool and impossibly smooth, were tangled around their bodies, a testament to the storm that had been raging for the better part of an hour. Her breath came in ragged gasps, each one a struggle against the rising tide of sensation that threatened to pull her under. His movements were slow, deliberate, a rhythm of possession that left no room for doubt, no space for thought. He owned this moment, and in this moment, he owned her. "Julian, please." The words were a broken whisper against his skin, a final, futile act of defiance from a mind that had long since lost the war with its body. He paused, his weight a comforting, terrifying pressure on top of her. He leaned down, his lips brushing against her ear, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated through her very bones. "Please, what, Alara? Please, stop." He moved again, deeper this time, drawing a sharp, involuntary cry from her throat, or "Please, don't." She squeezed her eyes shut, but the image of his face was seared into the darkness, the sharp planes of his cheeks, the intense, knowing look in his dark eyes, the slight, cruel curve of his lips. This was Julian Thorne, the man who had haunted her father's nightmares for 2 decades, the corporate predator who had brought Vance Industries to its knees. And now, he was her husband. This marriage wasn't born of love, or even affection. It was a contract, signed in the cold light of day in a lawyer's office, her freedom and her future traded for the survival of her family's legacy. She was supposed to be a sacrifice, a martyr to her father's cause. She was supposed to endure this, to remain untouched in her soul, a cold and beautiful statue in his gilded cage. But the man currently moving inside of her was not a monster of spreadsheets and hostile takeovers. He was a master of a different kind of negotiation, one where her body betrayed every term her mind had set. Every touch was calculated, every kiss a strategic move to dismantle her defenses, until all that was left was this raw, shameful, undeniable wanting. A low moan escaped her lips as he found a rhythm that shattered her last vestiges of control, and she knew, with a certainty that terrified her, that the price of saving her father was far higher than she had ever imagined. It wasn't just her name or her body she had signed away, it was her very self, lost somewhere in the searing heat of his embrace. The memory of that night, of Julian's body against hers and the city glittering below, was a future she couldn't have fathomed just 6 months prior. 6 months before, Alara Vance had stepped out of a taxi and onto the familiar pavement in front of the Vance Industries building, her Master of Business Administration degree feeling like a tangible shield in her hands, a golden ticket, not just to her own future, but to securing her family's. She had walked through the revolving doors with a confidence she had spent 2 years earning, ready to apply fresh ideas and youthful energy to the company her grandfather had built from nothing. But the chill she felt in the marble lobby had nothing to do with the air conditioning. It was a stillness, a quiet dread that hung in the air like dust motes in a sunbeam. The bustling energy she remembered from her summer internships was gone, replaced by hushed conversations that stopped the moment she approached. There were empty desks, their surfaces clean and impersonal, ghosts of the employees who had been let go in the first wave of what everyone was calling restructuring. Her father, Arthur Vance, had aged a decade in the 2 years she'd been away. The lion of industry, the man whose booming voice could command a boardroom and charm an investor in the same breath, seemed to have shrunk inside his expensive suits. His hair was thinner, more silver than salt and pepper, and there was a tremor in his hand that he tried to hide by constantly clasping it with the other. In their first meeting, he had put on a brave face, speaking of market downturns and temporary cash flow problems, but the numbers in the quarterly reports she stayed up all night to read told a different, far more terrifying story. They weren't in a downturn, they were in a nosedive, and there was no ground in sight. The weeks that followed were a blur of stale coffee, sleepless nights, and the relentless march of catastrophic data. Alara threw herself into the company's financials, her brand new education meeting, the brutal reality of multi-generational debt, and a series of disastrous investments her father had made, desperate gambles to outmaneuver a changing market. The language of her textbooks, filled with case studies of success and strategic turnarounds, felt like a cruel joke in the face of the cold, hard figures staring back at her. The words she now dealt in were insolvency, default, liquidation. Each one was a nail being hammered into her family's coffin. The meetings were the worst. She would sit beside her father, watching as men who had once been his friends and allies now looked at him with a mixture of pity and clinical detachment. They spoke in acronyms and percentages, their voices calm as they discussed the dismemberment of his life's work. She watched her father try to summon his old fire, his arguments growing weaker, his voice strained. She saw the moment the fight would leave his eyes, replaced by a gray, hollow look of defeat that broke her heart a little more each time. One evening, she found him alone in his vast office, not working, but simply staring at an old photograph on his desk, a picture of a younger him with her grandfather, standing on the construction site of their first factory. He built this all with his bare hands. "Alara," Arthur said, his voice thick with unshed tears. He believed that a man's name was his bond, that building something meant more than just making money. In that moment, Alara knew this wasn't just about a company. It was about her father's soul, his identity, the very essence of who he was. The pressure mounted. The phone calls started, first polite inquiries from banking associates, then sterner demands from credit managers, and finally, the cold, impersonal threats from law firms representing the creditors. Alara began to screen the calls herself, her voice a mask of calm professionalism as she negotiated for a few more days, another week, buying time they didn't have with promises she knew they couldn't keep. Each call chipped away at her, the humiliation a constant, bitter taste in her mouth. Her only escape was Liam. He was an architect, a man who built things with clean lines and solid foundations, a world away from the crumbling ruins of her own life. When she was with him, curled up on the sofa in his modest but sun-filled apartment, she could almost forget the suffocating weight of her family's name. Liam was warmth and stability and a future that felt blessedly simple. He would listen patiently as she vaguely described the stress at work, never pushing for the damning details she couldn't bring herself to share. He would rub her shoulders, make her tea, and talk about a different kind of life. "You know, we don't have to stay in the city forever," he said one rainy Tuesday night, his fingers tracing patterns on her back. "I could take a job with a smaller firm upstate. We could get a house with a yard. You wouldn't have to deal with all this pressure. We could just be happy, Alara." His words were meant to be a lifeline, a beautiful, heartfelt offer of sanctuary, but to Alara, they sounded like a death sentence. How could she abandon the ship while her father was going down with it? How could she run off to build a simple life of happiness on the ashes of his sacrifice and her grandfather's dream? The love and comfort he offered only sharpened the edges of her despair, highlighting the impossible choice before her. His simple, attainable happiness felt like a betrayal. So she would smile and kiss him and lie, telling him someday, while knowing, with a sickening certainty, that her future was no longer her own to design. It was tied to the fate of Vance Industries, and as she sat in another late-night meeting, watching the red ink bleed across another financial statement, she understood that the company wasn't just on the precipice of collapse. It was already falling, and it was dragging her and her father down into the abyss with it. She was desperate, and she knew, with a cold dread coiling in her stomach, that she would do anything, absolutely anything, to stop the fall. The end did not arrive with the bang of a gavel or the finality of a bankruptcy filing, but with the quiet, purring ring of a private telephone line. It was a call from Julian Thorne's personal assistant, the voice smooth and professionally detached, requesting a private meeting with Arthur Vance and his daughter. Not at his office, not at theirs, but on neutral ground, a private suite at the Carlyle. The request itself was a power play, a summons disguised as an invitation. Arthur, his face pale and taut with fury, had initially refused. "I will not be humiliated by that man," he had spat, his voice a shadow of its former authority. But Alara, her mind cold and pragmatic from weeks of staring into the abyss, had convinced him. "We have to go, Dad," she had said, her own voice barely a whisper. "We have to know what he wants." Hope was a fool's errand, but the sliver of a chance that Thorne might offer a survivable buyout, a merciful execution, was all they had left. They arrived exactly on time, a sign of deference they both resented. The suite was opulent, with sweeping views of Central Park, all muted tones and silent, expensive luxury. And in the center of it all, standing by the vast window, was Julian Thorne. He was not what Alara had expected. In her mind, he was a caricature, a corporate villain from a bad movie. The man before her was something far more dangerous. He was tall, with a lean, athletic build that his bespoke charcoal suit did nothing to hide. His hair was thick, a distinguished mix of dark brown and striking silver at the temples, cut with a precision that suggested immense personal discipline. When he turned to face them, Alara felt the air in her lungs compress. His face was all sharp angles and intelligent lines, but it was his eyes that held her captive. They were a deep, dark gray, shrewd and unnervingly perceptive, and for a fleeting moment as they met hers, she felt not like the daughter of his rival, but like the sole focus of his universe. "Arthur," Julian said, his voice a calm, deep baritone that seemed to absorb all the tension in the room. He nodded, a gesture that was too polite to be an insult and too familiar to be respectful. "Thank you for coming." "And Miss Vance," he said, his gaze shifting fully to Alara, "it's a pleasure to finally meet you properly." The way he said her name, a slight lingering on the syllables, made the hairs on her arms stand up. It felt personal, laden with a history she wasn't privy to. They sat, the Vances on a plush sofa, Julian in an armchair opposite them, creating the dynamic of a king holding court. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He spoke about Vance Industries not with glee or malice, but with the dispassionate air of a surgeon discussing a terminal patient. He laid out their situation with brutal, intimate clarity, referencing debts and defaulted loans she knew were buried deep in their ledgers. He had done more than his homework. He had conducted an autopsy on their dying company, and he was now presenting the findings. "There are no other buyers, Arthur," Julian stated, his voice even. "The banks have lost their nerve, and your assets are leveraged to the point of being liabilities. Bankruptcy is inevitable. You will lose everything. Your name will be a footnote in a business journal, a cautionary tale." Her father flinched as if struck, but Julian's gaze was fixed on Alara. It was as if he were speaking to her, challenging her, gauging her reaction. She met his stare, her back rigid, her hands clenched into fists in her lap. She refused to let him see her fear. After letting the silence stretch for an agonizing moment, Julian leaned forward slightly, the picture of a reasonable man. "But I am prepared to offer an alternative." A flicker of something treacherous hope ignited in Alara's chest. "I will absorb Vance Industries into the Thorne portfolio. I will assume all of its debt. The company name will be preserved as a subsidiary. The majority of your employees will keep their jobs. And you, Arthur, will be given a generous severance package that will allow you to retire with your dignity and your fortune intact." The offer was impossibly generous. It was salvation, a miracle delivered by the devil himself. Alara's mind raced. What was the catch? What did he want in return? A controlling stake wasn't enough. He would already have that. Public humiliation for her father? He seemed above such petty theatrics. Arthur, suspicious and proud, finally found his voice. "What is it you want, Thorne? What's the price for this?" "Generosity." Julian smiled then, a slow, deliberate curving of his lips that didn't reach his eyes. His gaze, which had been locked on Alara, did not waver. He was looking at her as if she were the only person in the room, as if her father's question was merely an incidental noise. "The price is simple," he said, his voice dropping, becoming more intimate, a sound meant only for her. "My acquisition of the company is contingent upon another merger, a more personal one." He paused, letting the weight of his unspoken words fill the space between them until Alara felt she would suffocate. "I require your daughter's hand in marriage." The world tilted on its axis. For a moment, there was only a roaring in Alara's ears. The statement was so absurd, so archaic, it felt like a line from a Victorian novel. Then, the full, monstrous reality of it crashed down upon her. This wasn't about business. This had never been about business. This was about her. Her father shot to his feet, his face a mask of purple rage. "You son of a bitch," he roared, the old lion finding one last burst of strength. You dare to speak about my daughter as if she's a piece of property, a clause in a contract." Julian remained perfectly still in his chair, his composure utterly unruffled by the outburst. He waited until Arthur's fury had exhausted itself into ragged breaths. "I am speaking of her," Julian said, his voice dangerously soft as the most valuable asset in this entire transaction. "The only one I'm truly interested in. This is my offer. It is the only offer, and it is not negotiable." He finally rose from his chair, his height and presence dominating the room. He placed a slim, leather-bound folder on the coffee table. "The agreement is in there. You have 24 hours to decide." He walked towards the door, pausing as he passed Alara's side of the sofa. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, smell the faint, clean scent of his cologne. He didn't look down at her, but he spoke in that same low, conspiratorial tone. "I do hope you'll make the wise decision, Miss Vance, for everyone's sake." And then he was gone, leaving behind a suffocating silence and a proposal that was so much worse than ruin. It was a life sentence. The 24 hours Julian Thorne had given them was a courtesy, not a choice. Alara knew this the moment he left the hotel suite, leaving a silence so profound it felt like a physical presence. Her father, looking shrunken and utterly defeated, had collapsed back onto the sofa, whispering, "Number absolutely not. I won't let you." But his protest was the desperate plea of a man with no power left, the ghost of a king in a fallen kingdom. Alara looked at him, truly looked at him, and she did not see the formidable Arthur Vance who had built a commercial empire. She saw a tired, frightened old man, his legacy turning to dust in his hands, and she felt a love so fierce and protective, it eclipsed everything else, her own future, her own happiness, her own heart. The decision was made not with words, but in the quiet, resolute calm that settled over her. She would make the sacrifice, but first she had to perform an execution. She chose their place, a small, independent coffee shop in the West Village, with mismatched armchairs and the constant, comforting smell of roasted beans and old books. It was where they'd had their third date, where they'd celebrated her acceptance into business school, where he'd first told her he loved her over a shared slice of carrot cake. To bring him here to destroy him felt like a unique and special kind of cruelty, a desecration of their shared history. The rain outside matched the gray misery in her soul, streaking down the large picture window like tears. She was early, nursing a cup of black coffee she couldn't taste, her stomach a tight, painful knot of dread. Every nerve in her body screamed at her to run, to call him and tell him she was sick, to put off the inevitable. But she knew that delay was a luxury she couldn't afford. This needed to be a clean cut, a swift and brutal amputation. When Liam walked in, shaking the rain from his jacket, his easy smile was a physical blow. He was everything good and light in her world, his face open and honest, his eyes, the color of warm honey, lighting up the moment they found hers. He was wearing his favorite worn-in gray sweater, the one she loved to borrow on lazy Sunday mornings. He was the embodiment of a life she had, until yesterday, believed was hers for the taking. "Hey you," he said, leaning down to kiss her, his lips soft and familiar. She forced herself not to recoil, but she couldn't bring herself to kiss him back, offering only a cold, unresponsive press of her lips. He pulled back, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. "Everything okay? You sound distant." She steeled herself, dredging up an icy resolve from the depths of her despair. "We need to talk, Liam." The 4 words, the oldest and cruelest of cliches, hung in the air between them. The smile vanished from his face, replaced by a cautious concern. "Okay," he said slowly, sitting down opposite her. "I'm listening. Is this about the company? Your dad?" His perceptiveness was another twist of the knife. He knew her so well, and she had to use that knowledge against him. "In a way," she began, her voice carefully modulated, devoid of the emotion that was clawing at her throat. "This whole situation, it's made me realize some things about what I want, about what's important to me." She looked at him, but her gaze was intentionally flat, looking through him rather than at him. She had practiced this in the mirror, this look of detached appraisal. "I don't think this is working anymore." He stared at her, utterly baffled. "Not working? Alara, what are you talking about? We were talking about moving in together last week." "I know," she said, the lie tasting like acid on her tongue. "But that was before. Before I really had to face reality. The life you want, Liam. The small house, the quiet weekends. It's a beautiful dream. It really island. But it's your dream, not mine. Each word was a betrayal, a twisting of the beautiful future he had painted for them into something small and undesirable. "What are you saying?" he asked, his voice strained with disbelief. "That you don't want that anymore? That you don't want me?" Here it was, the moment of impact. She took a breath, summoning the image of Julian Thorne in his perfect suit, his voice full of cold, absolute power. She channeled that ice into her veins. "I'm saying that I was playing house. I was pretending that a simple life would be enough for me, but it's not. I want more. I need more. The world my father built, the power, the influence. I thought I was above it, but I'm not. I belong in that world, and you don't." The cruelty of her words hung in the air, thick and poisonous. She was painting herself as a shallow, ambitious monster, and the hurt that bloomed in his eyes was so profound, so pure, it almost made her break. "I don't believe you," he whispered, shaking his head. "This isn't you, Alara. This is your father's stress talking. We can get through this together. Whatever it is, I'm here." His loyalty, his unwavering love, was the final thing she had to kill. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a cold, clinical whisper that ensured there would be no misunderstanding, no hope left to cling to. "There is no we, Liam. There is no us. I don't love you." She forced herself to hold his gaze as the lie left her lips, watching the light in his honey-colored eyes extinguish completely, as if a switch had been flicked. She saw the precise moment his heart broke, and she knew the image would be burned into her memory forever. "I thought I did," she continued, twisting the knife, "but what I felt for you was a comfort, a safe place to hide. But I don't want to be safe anymore. I want to be powerful." He was silent for a long time, simply staring at her, his face a canvas of shattered disbelief and dawning agony. The bustling warmth of the coffee shop faded into a muted roar in her ears. There was only Liam's broken expression, a masterpiece of her own creation. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse, unrecognizable. "I see," he said, and she knew that he didn't see it all, but that he had accepted the ugly picture she had painted. He stood up, his movements stiff and uncoordinated. He reached into his pocket as if to pull out his wallet to pay, then stopped, a bitter, broken laugh escaping his lips. He simply looked at her one last time, his eyes now holding the detached pain of a stranger's. Then he turned and walked out, disappearing into the gray, weeping afternoon. Alara didn't move. She sat there, frozen, her coffee cold, her heart a hollow cavity in her chest. The sacrifice was complete. She had cut away the best part of herself, leaving behind an empty, polished shell, a shell that was now perfectly suited for its new owner. The week between the agreement and the wedding was a hollow, silent affair. Alara moved through her father's house like a ghost, packing away the remnants of her old life, each book and photograph a painful reminder of the future she had incinerated. The house itself seemed to be holding its breath, steeped in a quiet shame. The lawyers had handled everything, exchanging documents with a bloodless efficiency that made the entire transaction feel even more grotesque. Alara was now, legally, a commodity, her value itemized in clauses and subclauses. Then, 2 nights before the ceremony, Julian's assistant called. "Mr. Thorne," the voice said, "requested the pleasure of Miss Vance's company for dinner to finalize the last of the arrangements." It was another command disguised as a request, and Alara knew her attendance was as non-negotiable as the marriage contract itself. She prepared for the dinner with the meticulous care of a soldier preparing for battle. This would be their first encounter since the horrifying proposal, and she was determined to set the tone. She would be cold, untouchable, a partner in a business deal, and nothing more. She chose her armor carefully, a floor-length slip dress of emerald green silk. The color was chosen for its coolness, its association with money and emotional distance. The fabric, she reasoned, was sophisticated, a liquid shield that would project an image of icy control. She swept her hair back into a severe, elegant chignon at the nape of her neck, leaving no loose strands to suggest softness or vulnerability. Her makeup was minimal but sharp, her lips painted a deep, forbidding shade of red. As she looked at her reflection, she saw a stranger, a polished, hard-edged woman she didn't recognize. It was perfect. The restaurant was a place so exclusive it didn't have a name on the door. The interior was a sanctuary of hushed tones, dim lighting, and the silent, balletic movements of the staff. Julian was already there, seated at a secluded corner table. He rose as she approached, and for a heart-stopping moment, the sheer force of his presence threatened to undo her carefully constructed composure. In the soft light, the silver in his hair seemed to glow, and his dark eyes, fixed on her, were filled with an intensity that felt like a physical touch. "Alara," he said, his voice a low murmur that was somehow both intimate and commanding. "You look breathtaking." The compliment was standard, but the way he said it, the way his gaze swept over her from head to toe, was anything but. It was not the appreciative glance of a gentleman. It was the thorough, assessing inventory of a connoisseur examining a priceless acquisition. She had intended for the dress to be a shield, but as she sat down, she realized her strategic error. The silk, which had felt like armor in her bedroom, now felt like a second skin under his relentless gaze. It clung to the curve of her waist, hinted at the shape of her hips, and pooled around her feet in a way that seemed almost indecently luxurious. She felt exposed, not shielded. The dinner conversation was a masterful exercise in control, a subtle war waged over wine glasses and artfully arranged plates of food. Alara tried to keep the topic confined to the logistics of the wedding, the timeline, the public statement. She spoke in a clipped, professional tone, as if they were discussing a product launch. Regarding the press release, she began, "I believe a simple, direct statement is best," focusing on the strategic advantages of the merger. Julian waved a dismissive hand, a gesture of effortless authority. "My team will handle the press, Alara. The business is settled. Tonight, I'm more interested in the personal side of the merger." He leaned back, swirling the deep red wine in his glass, his eyes never leaving her face. "Tell me about your thesis at school. International market volatility, wasn't it?" An ambitious topic. The question caught her off guard. He had researched her. The knowledge was both invasive and, to a small, traitorous part of her, flattering. She gave a curt, academic summary, but he pressed further. "What were your plans? Before all this?" The question hung between them, a casual reference to the destruction he had wrought. "My plans are no longer relevant," she said, her voice colder than she intended. "Indeed," he replied, a faint smile playing on his lips. "And that is a pity. A mind like yours shouldn't be idle. Perhaps we can find a new project for you. Within the Thorn Foundation, perhaps." It was both a promise and a threat, a reminder that her mind, like her body, now belonged to him, to be utilized at his discretion. Throughout the meal, she was hyper-aware of him. She noticed the way his long, elegant fingers held his wine glass, the quiet confidence in the set of his shoulders, the way his gaze would drop to her mouth just before she took a sip of water. He wasn't just dining with her, he was studying her, learning her, mapping her reactions with a disturbing precision. A dozen times she felt a strange, unwelcome heat spread across her skin, a tingling awareness that had nothing to do with anger or fear. It was something else, something primal and involuntary, a faint hum of energy in the air between them. When he spoke, she found herself watching the movement of his lips, and she hated herself for it. This was the man who had bought her, who had forced her to destroy the only pure love she had ever known. Yet, her body seemed to have forgotten the memo. It was responding to his proximity, to the low timbre of his voice, to the sheer masculine power he radiated without effort. As the evening ended and they stood to leave, the moment came. The maitre d' rushed to open the door, and Julian placed a hand on the small of her back to guide her. It was a common, almost unconscious gesture of courtesy, but from him, it was a declaration. His hand was warm and firm, a shock of heat through the thin silk of her dress. She tensed, her entire body going rigid. His touch was not light or fleeting. It was a solid, proprietary weight, a brand. As they stepped out into the cool night air, he didn't remove his hand. Instead, he leaned in, his lips so close to her ear she could feel the warmth of his breath on her skin. His voice was a husky, conspiratorial whisper, a secret meant only for her. That dress is exquisite, Alara, he murmured, his thumb drawing a slow, deliberate circle against the base of her spine. The unexpected, intimate movement sent a jolt of pure electricity through her, stealing her breath. But I suspect what's underneath is even more divine. She froze. The world seemed to stop for a single, searing second. Outrage, fear, and humiliation warred within her, but beneath it all, a different, more terrifying sensation unfurled a deep, traitorous flutter of heat, low in her belly. It was a spark of pure, physical arousal, and it horrified her more than any threat. She wanted to pull away, to slap his handsome, arrogant face, but she was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by the complexity of her own reaction. In the silent ride home, she stared blankly at the passing city lights, her mind replaying the moment. He had touched her, and he had laid a claim. But worse, far worse, was the terrifying realization that some small, dark part of her had not wanted him to stop. The first crack in her armor had appeared, and she knew with absolute certainty that he had not only seen it, but he had been the one to put it there. The wedding was a sterile, bloodless affair conducted in a private chamber at the city courthouse that smelled faintly of disinfectant and old paper. There was no music, no flowers, no loving guests. The only attendees were two stoic lawyers who served as witnesses, their expressions carefully neutral. Alara wore a simple, cream-colored dress that felt more like a uniform than a bridal gown. Julian stood beside her, a pillar of dark, quiet confidence in a perfectly tailored suit. He spoke his vows in a clear, steady voice, his words sounding less like a pledge of love and more like the final reading of a verdict. When it was her turn, the words caught in her throat, tasting of ash and sacrifice. She forced them out, her voice a thin, reedy sound that was swallowed by the solemn quiet of the room. The officiant, a man with a tired, bored face, pronounced them husband and wife. Julian slid a heavy, cold platinum band onto her finger. It felt less like a ring and more like a manacle. The transaction was complete. The ride to their new home was conducted in a silence so thick it was almost suffocating. The penthouse occupied the entire top floor of a sleek, modern skyscraper, a glass-walled palace in the sky. As they stepped out of the private elevator and into the vast, minimalist living space, Alara was struck by the cold, impersonal beauty of it all. It was a space designed to impress, not to comfort, filled with expensive art and designer furniture that looked as though it had never been touched. It was not a home, it was a showcase, and she was now its newest, most prized exhibit. Without a word, Julian gestured towards a hallway. "The master suite is that way. I trust you'll find everything you need." It was a dismissal, and for a fleeting absurd moment, she felt a wave of relief. Perhaps that was all he wanted: her name, her presence in his home, the symbol of his victory. But she knew better. In the master bedroom, which was larger than her entire old apartment, a single suitcase of her things had been unpacked by an invisible, efficient hand. Laid out on the enormous, neatly made bed was a nightgown of pure white silk. It was simple, elegant, and devastatingly symbolic. It was the sacrificial lamb's fleece. With numb, detached movements, she showered, the hot water doing little to warm the ice that had settled deep in her bones. She slipped the cool silk over her skin and sat on the edge of the bed, her back ramrod straight, and waited for the ordeal to begin. She mentally prepared herself for a swift, brutal consummation, a physical stamping of the contract's final clause. She would endure it. She would close her eyes, think of nothing, and let him take what he had paid for. When Julian entered the room sometime later, she flinched. He had changed out of his suit and was wearing a simple, black silk robe tied loosely at the waist, a dark contrast to her virginal white. He wasn't moving towards the bed. Instead, he walked to a small bar in the corner of the room and poured 2 glasses of amber liquid. He brought one to her, his fingers brushing hers as she took the glass. Her hand was trembling so badly she was afraid she would drop it. "Brandy," he said, his voice calm, "to celebrate." He didn't drink his own, but sat in an armchair opposite the bed, simply watching her over the rim of his glass. The silence stretched, each tick of an unseen clock amplifying her terror. "You're wondering why," he said at last. Not a question, but a statement. "Why you?" She said nothing, merely staring at the expensive rug beneath her feet. "I first saw you 5 years ago," he continued, his voice taking on a low, narrative cadence, the voice of a man telling a story he had replayed in his mind 1,000 times. At the Metropolitan Opera Gala. You were with your father. You couldn't have been more than 19. You were wearing a blue dress, the color of a twilight sky. You looked bored with the pomp, annoyed by the sycophants fawning over your father. In a room full of the most powerful people in the city, all of them wearing masks of civility and ambition, you were the only real thing I saw. I knew then. Alara looked up, her confusion momentarily overriding her fear. This wasn't the talk of a corporate raider. It was the language of obsession. You knew what? She whispered. He smiled, a slow, knowing expression. That everything I had built, all the power I had amassed, it was all just a means to an end. And you were the end. His confession did not comfort her. It terrified her on a more profound level. This wasn't just a man who had wanted her father's company. This was a man who had wanted her, had planned for years. She was not a casualty of war. She was the entire purpose of it. He stood up and took the now empty brandy glass from her nerveless fingers. He set it aside and gently took her hand, pulling her to her feet. His touch was not forceful, but it was inescapable. I am not the monster you think I am, Alara, he murmured, his other hand coming up to gently cup her cheek. I don't want your submission. I want your surrender. Before she could process his words, he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a brutal kiss, not an act of claiming, but a slow, deeply persuasive exploration. It was patient, coaxing, and it sent a wave of bewildering heat through her body. Her mind screamed in protest, but her lips, of their own volition, softened under his. He broke the kiss and looked down at her, his eyes dark with a hunger that was far more potent than simple lust. I have waited 5 years for this, he whispered. I will not rush. His hands went to the delicate straps of her nightgown, and with an agonizing slowness, he slid them from her shoulders. The white silk whispered down her body, pooling at her feet like a fallen halo. He looked at her then, his gaze a tangible thing, appreciative and reverent, as if he were beholding a masterpiece he had waited a lifetime to acquire. She felt a flush of shame and, to her horror, a flicker of pride. He led her to the bed and laid her down, his movements fluid and certain. He began to touch her, to explore her body with a skilled, patient hand that seemed to know what she wanted before she did. She tried to retreat into the cold, numb place in her mind, to turn her body into an unfeeling object, but his touch was too precise, too knowing. He found the sensitive arch of her foot, the tender skin behind her knee, the spot on her neck that made her shiver. Her body, the traitor, began to respond. A soft sigh escaped her lips. Her skin tingled, her muscles unknotted. As he moved over her, positioning himself between her thighs, she felt a fresh wave of panic. She shut her eyes tight, preparing for the final violation. But he stopped. He leaned down, his lips brushing her ear. Alara, he commanded, his voice a low, insistent growl. Look at me. It was a denial of her last defense, her escape into dissociation. He was demanding her presence, her full participation in her own undoing. I can't, she breathed, a tear finally escaping and tracing a hot path down her temple. You can, he insisted, and then he pushed into her, a slow, deliberate invasion that was both a shock and a strange kind of relief. A sound was torn from her throat, a choked gasp that was half protest, half pleasure, and it was the pleasure that shattered her. He began to move, a slow, deep rhythm that was relentlessly attuned to her body's unwilling responses. He was teaching her a new reality, one in which her own flesh and blood was a turncoat, allied with the enemy. The battle was no longer between her and him. It was between her mind and her body. And as he drove her higher and higher, towards a peak she had never known, she realized, with a soul-crushing certainty, that it was a battle she was about to lose. The days that followed the wedding night bled into one another, each one a perfect, sterile copy of the last. Alara's new life was a study in luxurious emptiness. She would wake in the enormous bed, the sheets, an ocean of cool, high-thread count cotton, and she would almost always be alone. Julian was a specter in her mornings, gone before the sun had fully risen over the East River, A faint, lingering scent of expensive soap and ambition, the only proof he had been there at all. Her time was unstructured, a vast, empty expanse she was meant to fill. A silent, efficient housekeeper would serve her breakfast on the terrace overlooking the city, a view so magnificent it felt like a taunt, a constant reminder of the world teeming with life and purpose just beyond her reach. She was a Rapunzel in a glass tower, only there was no prince to rescue her, for she was already married to the dragon. Julian's presence in her life was felt primarily through his acquisitions. Gifts would appear without ceremony. One afternoon, a black velvet box from Cartier was left on her pillow, containing a diamond necklace, so heavy and brilliant it felt like a beautiful yoke. A team of personal shoppers filled her cavernous walk-in closet with an entire wardrobe of designer clothes in her exact size, racks of silks and cashmeres she had no occasion to wear. The keys to a brand new Aston Martin were left on the marble kitchen island with a simple, unsigned note that read, "For your convenience." She understood these were not gestures of affection. They were furnishings for the gilded cage. They were the adornments he required for the woman who bore his name, markers of his status and success. She was the ultimate luxury good, and he was ensuring her packaging was impeccable. She accepted them with a polite, hollow thank you. Her indifference, a small, silent rebellion he seemed to find more amusing than insulting. In the long, quiet afternoons, a profound loneliness would settle over her, a grief for the simple, vibrant life she had lost. She would walk for hours through Central Park, just to feel the press of a crowd around her, to hear the laughter of children and the arguments of lovers, to feel anonymous and normal for a few precious moments. She would see a young woman reading a book on a bench, her brow furrowed in concentration, and feel a sharp, painful longing for her own lost ambitions, for the Alara Vance who had a mind of her own, a future she was building for herself. The ghost of Liam was everywhere, in the couples holding hands, in the window of every cozy coffee shop she passed. The memory of his warmth, his easy laugh, his gentle love, was a constant aching counterpoint to the cold, calculated world she now inhabited. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to shift. The monster began to show glimpses of the man. It started in the library. Alara had been drawn to a large, chaotic, abstract painting that hung over the fireplace, a violent slash of red and black that she found both ugly and compelling. She was staring at it one evening when Julian came in, home earlier than usual. She expected him to walk past, but he stopped beside her, his presence a familiar disruption in her personal space. They stood in silence for a moment before he spoke. "It's a depiction of the fall of Icarus," he said, his voice quiet, contemplative. Most artists focus on the tragedy of the fall itself. This one captures the terrifying ecstasy of the flight just before the end. The moment he knew the sun would destroy him, but flew towards it anyway. His interpretation was so unexpected, so insightful, it startled her. They spoke for 10 minutes about art, about the arrogance of creation and the beauty in destruction. It was the first real conversation they'd ever had, a brief, startling exchange between two intelligent minds, and for a moment, she forgot he was her captor. He was just a man with a surprising, hidden depth. Another night, she awoke to the sound of music, a melancholy, achingly beautiful cello suite by Bach, drifting from his study. She found him sitting in the dark, a glass of whiskey in his hand, staring out at the city lights. He wasn't the powerful tycoon, the ruthless predator. In the shadows, his face looked unguarded, etched with a profound weariness, almost a sadness. He noticed her standing in the doorway and didn't immediately mask his expression. "My father used to play this," he said, his voice rough. "He was a professor of classics. He believed in books and music more than he believed in money. He thought my ambition was vulgar." It was a tiny, shocking glimpse into his past. A hint of a wound, a suggestion that the man known as Julian Thorne was not born, but made, forged in the fires of some long-ago conflict. The revelation didn't excuse his actions, but it complicated them, adding a layer of humanity to the monster she thought she knew. The turning point, the gesture that truly began to dismantle her defenses, came on a cool autumn evening. Alara was on the terrace, hugging her arms around herself, watching the endless stream of headlights flowing like blood through the city's arteries. She felt a deep, chilling sense of isolation, of being utterly and completely alone. She heard the glass door slide open and tensed, expecting him to approach her from behind, to initiate the now familiar ritual of their nights together, a physical act that was expert and demanding but devoid of any real intimacy. But he didn't touch her. He just stood there for a moment. Then she heard him go back inside. She stayed where she was, a bitter disappointment mixing with her relief. He returned a moment later. She felt a sudden weight and an impossible softness settle over her shoulders. He had draped a heavy, charcoal gray cashmere throw around her, tucking it gently around her neck. The warmth was immediate, seeping into her chilled skin. He stood beside her, his hands in his pockets, looking out at the same view. "You'll catch a cold," he said, his voice a simple statement of fact. There was no seduction in his tone, no hidden meaning. It was just care. A simple, practical, human act of concern. It was the first thing he had ever given her that wasn't a symbol of his wealth or her ownership. It was a gift of simple comfort, with no expectation of anything in return. The unexpectedness of it, the pure, unadorned kindness, broke something inside her. She felt a sharp, painful sting behind her eyes, and she had to turn her head away so he wouldn't see the tears that threatened to fall. That night, she slept wrapped in the cashmere throw, its softness a strange comfort. The hatred she felt for him hadn't vanished, but it was no longer a simple, solid thing. It was now tangled up with a dangerous, insidious new feeling, curiosity. She was beginning to look at the bars of her gilded cage and wonder about the man who had built it. The fragile truce Alara had forged with her new reality was shattered by a single sun-drenched photograph. It appeared without warning as she scrolled idly through the social media feed of an old acquaintance, a mundane act of escapism that suddenly turned into a landmine. The picture was of Liam, his arm wrapped around a smiling, sun-kissed woman, an engagement ring sparkling on the woman's finger. Liam was smiling too, a wide, genuine, and utterly happy smile that Alara hadn't seen on his face since the day she had destroyed him in that rainy cafe. He looked lighter, free. The caption was a fountain of cheerful congratulations and heart emojis. For a moment, Alara couldn't breathe. It wasn't jealousy she felt, not in its purest form. It was the crushing, suffocating weight of her own guilt. She had made him a martyr for her family's sake, and he had, it seemed, moved on. He had found the happiness she had denied him, while she remained trapped, a beautiful ornament in a cold, silent penthouse. The sacrifice felt utterly, devastatingly one-sided. That evening, a reckless, self-destructive impulse took hold of her. She roamed the vast, silent apartment, each piece of priceless art and designer furniture mocking her with its lifeless perfection. She ended up in Julian's library, the room where he had revealed his humanity, now the chosen stage for her own unraveling. Her eyes fell on a crystal decanter of scotch on his mahogany desk, its contents the color of dark, liquid gold. She never drank spirits, but tonight she wanted to burn. She poured a generous amount into a heavy glass, the unfamiliar burn of the alcohol a welcome punishment as it slid down her throat. She poured another, and then another, the sharp edges of her grief and guilt slowly beginning to blur. She curled into a leather armchair, a forgotten volume of poetry falling to the floor, as the expensive liquor and her own misery pulled her under into a hazy, tear-soaked fog. That is how Julian found her. He came into the library, his movements silent as always, and found her not passed out, but awash in her sorrow. Her face was stained with tears, her hair had come loose from its elegant chignon, and the glass was held loosely in her hand, her knuckles white. She looked up at him as he approached, her vision swimming slightly. She expected anger, a cold reprimand, for her lack of decorum, for touching his things, for being so disgracefully human in his perfect house, but his face held no anger. There was only a quiet, unreadable intensity in his dark eyes. He knelt before her chair, his expensive suit creasing, and gently took the glass from her hand, setting it far out of her reach. He didn't speak. He simply lifted a hand and, with a startling tenderness, used his thumb to wipe a tear from her cheek. The gesture, so simple and so unexpected, was her undoing. A choked sob escaped her, then another, until she was weeping uncontrollably, all the pent-up loneliness, guilt, and despair of the past months pouring out of her in a single, broken torrent. She didn't pull away when he gathered her into his arms, lifting her from the chair as if she weighed nothing. Her own arms, of their own accord, wrapped around his neck, clinging to him as he carried her out of the library and down the long, silent hall to the bedroom. The journey felt surreal, a dreamlike transition from the depths of her emotional hell into the strange sanctuary of his arms. He was not her captor in that moment. He was her rescuer, the only solid thing in her collapsing world. He laid her gently on the bed, the silk of the comforter cool against her heated skin. The low light of the bedside lamps cast long shadows across the room, creating a sense of intimacy that was both terrifying and deeply seductive. He began to undress her, his movements slow and deliberate, the buttons of her silk blouse, the clasp of her skirt, all undone with a steady, unhurried hand. Her clothes were damp with spilled scotch and tears, and as he stripped them away, it felt as though he were stripping away the misery itself, peeling back the layers of her grief to find the woman beneath. When she was wearing nothing but her lingerie, he paused. She had chosen the set that morning, a delicate, intricate creation of black lace, a secret act of rebellion, a dark color to match her dark mood. Julian's gaze lingered on it, a flicker of something knowing and appreciative in his eyes. He trailed a single finger along the lace edge of her bra. "Black suits you, my dear," he murmured, his voice a low, husky vibration that resonated deep inside her. The color of secrets and hidden desires. This time, the words didn't feel like a taunt. They felt like an observation, as if he could see the tangled, complicated mess of her soul and, instead of being repulsed, was drawn to it. This time, there was no resistance. The battle within her had been waged and lost in the bottom of that whiskey glass. All that was left was a profound, aching need to not be alone, to feel something, anything, other than the sharp sting of her own guilt. When he kissed her, she kissed him back, a desperate, hungry meeting of mouths. The lovemaking that followed was nothing like the first time. The calculated precision of their wedding night was gone, replaced by a raw, responsive intimacy that left her breathless. He was attuned to her, to the soft sighs and involuntary trembles of her body, his touch both a question and a command. It was a slow, consuming exploration, a dark and silent conversation between two damaged people. She was no longer a passive participant. She was an active accomplice in her own surrender. Her hands moved from his shoulders to his back, her nails scraping lightly against his skin. The sounds she made were not of protest or conflicted surprise, but of pure, unadorned pleasure. At some point, lost in the sensations he was creating, she heard her own voice, broken and breathless, whisper his name. Julian. Oh God. He paused above her, his face taut in the dim light, and leaned down to whisper in her ear, his words a possessive, final claim. God has nothing to do with this, Alara. This is all us. And as he brought her to a shattering, all-consuming climax, she knew he was right. This pleasure, this shameful, exquisite solace was a sin they had created all on their own. Afterwards, she lay tangled in the sheets and in his arms, the scent of him all around her. The cold shame of their wedding night was absent, replaced by a confusing, lingering warmth and a profound sense of disquiet. She had sought oblivion, and in its place, she had found a dangerous, addictive form of connection. She had turned to the monster for comfort, and he had shown her that he knew the language of her body better than she knew it herself. The nights following her drunken surrender in the library marked a subtle but profound shift in the climate of the penthouse. The icy tension that had defined their cohabitation began to thaw, replaced by a quiet, watchful intimacy. Julian was no less powerful or possessive, but there was a new current running between them, a shared secret of her vulnerability and his unexpected comfort. They would sometimes eat dinner together in a comfortable silence, or he would find her reading in the library and stay for a while, nursing a drink, the space between them charged not with hostility, but with a complex, unspoken awareness. He was no longer just the monster who had bought her. He was the man who had carried her to bed, who knew the sound of her pleasure, who had seen the ugly, broken parts of her and had not turned away. This fragile peace, this semblance of domesticity, made her curious. For the first time, she began to wonder not just what he was, but who he had been. Her opportunity came when he was called away on an urgent business trip to Hong Kong. It was the first time she had been truly alone in the penthouse for more than a day, and the silence was vast and unnerving. For 2 days, she drifted through the opulent rooms, feeling more like a ghost than ever. On the 3rd day, a restless energy, born of boredom, and that dangerous, burgeoning curiosity drew her to the one place in the penthouse that remained his exclusive domain, his private study. The door was unlocked, as always, not because he was careless, but because his authority was the only lock he needed. Standing before it, her heart hammered against her ribs. To cross this threshold felt like a significant transgression, a violation of the unspoken boundaries that still governed their relationship. But the urge to understand, to find some piece of the puzzle that would explain the man who now owned her life, was too powerful to resist. The study was the man himself, distilled into a single room. It was meticulously organized, masculine and controlled. Floor-to-ceiling shelves were filled with books on history, philosophy, and corporate law, not a single frivolous novel among them. The air smelled of old leather, paper, and the faint, clean scent of his cologne. It was on his desk, a vast, imposing piece of dark mahogany, that she found it. She hadn't been searching for anything in particular, her fingers just ghosting over the cool, polished wood. In the bottom drawer, tucked away at the back, was a slim, leather-bound portfolio, secured with a simple brass latch. It was old, the leather worn smooth with time. It felt different from everything else in the room. It felt personal. With trembling fingers, she lifted the latch. The contents were not what she expected. There were no financial documents or corporate secrets. The first thing she saw was a faded photograph. 2 young men, barely in their early 20s, stood with their arms thrown over each other's shoulders, squinting in the bright sun, a half-finished industrial building behind them. They were both smiling, their faces alight with the fearless optimism of youth. One of the men was a startlingly young Julian Thorne, his hair dark and unruly, his eyes full of a fire she had never seen. The other man, her breath hitched in her throat, was her father, Arthur Vance. They didn't look like rivals. They looked like partners. They looked like friends. Beneath the photograph were a set of aged blueprints and a business proposal, the paper brittle with age. The company name on the letterhead was Vance Thorne Innovations. She scanned the documents, her MBA-trained mind quickly grasping the concept. A revolutionary logistics and supply chain management software, an idea so far ahead of its time it would have been transformative. She recognized the core of the algorithm. It was the very technology that had become the cornerstone of Vance Industries' success in the early years, the foundation upon which her family's empire was built. Then she found the letters. First, a signed partnership agreement, detailing a 50-50 split between Arthur Vance and Julian Thorne. Then, a series of increasingly desperate letters from a young Julian to her father, questioning stalled funding, asking about rumors of new investors. And finally, at the very bottom, was the kill shot. It was a single sheet of paper, a carbon copy of a handwritten letter from her father to his own father, her grandfather. The confident, looping script was instantly recognizable. In it, Arthur coolly and methodically outlined his plan to leverage the Vance family's capital and legal team to dissolve the partnership, restructure the patents solely under the Vance name, and force Thorne out. He is brilliant but naive, her father had written of the young man in the photograph. He has the idea, but we have the legacy. In the end, that is all that matters. Alara felt the blood drain from her face. A wave of nausea washed over her, so intense she had to grip the edge of the desk to steady herself. The entire narrative of her life, the bedrock of her identity and the justification for her sacrifice, was a lie. Her father was not the noble victim of a corporate predator, he was the predator. He had taken his friend's dream, his future, and had broken him, leaving him with nothing but the ashes of their shared ambition. Julian Thorne hadn't risen from nowhere to become her father's rival. He had clawed his way back from the ruin her father had left him in. Every ruthless deal, every corporate conquest, every step he had taken to build his own empire had not been simple ambition. It had been the long, slow, meticulous construction of a weapon designed for a single purpose, to one day point directly at the heart of Vance Industries and the man who had betrayed him. The rivalry wasn't about business, it was about a stolen life. And his pursuit of her, it was no longer just the act of a possessive monster. It was the endgame of a 20-year quest for vengeance. In his twisted, brutal calculus, her father had stolen his creation, his future, so he in turn would take her father's, a future for a future. It didn't excuse the horror of what he had done to her, of turning her into a bargaining chip, but it explained it. The cold clarity of it was terrifying. She sat there in the silence of his study, the evidence of her father's original sin spread before her, and felt the world shift beneath her feet. She had sold herself to save a hero, only to discover she had sacrificed herself for a villain, and the monster whose bed she now shared was a man who had been created by the very person she had tried to save. The lines were no longer blurred. They had been completely erased, leaving her stranded in a vast, gray wilderness of moral ambiguity. Julian was due back the next day, and for the first time she had no idea who or what she would be facing. Julian returned from Hong Kong the next day, stepping back into the penthouse with the same quiet authority as always. But Alara felt as though the very air in the apartment had been rearranged. The knowledge she now possessed sat like a heavy, indigestible stone in her gut. She watched him across the dinner table, studying the familiar lines of his face, the confident set of his jaw, and saw him through a new, deeply unsettling lens. He was a man built on a foundation of her father's treachery. Every cool glance, every possessive touch, was now layered with a 20-year history of pain and vengeance she hadn't understood before. She said nothing of her discovery, the secret, a buzzing, living thing inside her, and the silence between them was no longer comfortable, but fraught with the weight of all the things she now knew. The past she was so desperately trying to reconcile erupted into her present 2 days later. She was returning from a solitary walk, stepping into the cavernous, marble-floored lobby of the building, when a voice called her name, a voice she thought she would never hear again outside of her own guilt-ridden memories. Alara. She froze, her hand clutching the strap of her purse. Liam was standing by the concierge desk, looking thin, haunted, and utterly out of place amidst the sleek corporate wealth of her new world. The happy, smiling man from the photograph was gone, replaced by someone whose eyes held the same shattered look he'd had in the coffee shop. "What are you doing here, Liam?" she asked, her voice low and strained, acutely aware of the doorman's discreetly averted gaze. "I heard things," he said, taking a step towards her. "Rumors. That your father's company was bought out by Thorne. That you married him. I didn't want to believe it. I thought it was some kind of sick joke." He looked at her, his gaze sweeping over her expensive coat, the simple but elegant pearl earrings she wore, the heavy platinum band on her finger. "But it's true." His voice broke. "Alara, what happened? Whatever he has on you, whatever he forced you to do, we can fight it. It's not too late. We can just leave, right now. I don't care about the money or the company. We can disappear." His words, which months ago would have sounded like salvation, now sounded like a foreign language from a world she no longer inhabited. He was offering her the past, a life of simple goodness and righteous struggle. But she was no longer simple, and after discovering her father's secret, she no longer felt righteous. She was a part of this dark, complicated world now, a world of betrayal and long-game vengeance that Liam, in his decency, could never comprehend. "You need to go," she said, her voice colder than she intended. "There's nothing to fight. This is my life now." "This isn't a life, Alara. It's a prison," he insisted, his voice rising with desperation. "Look at you. You're like a ghost. The woman I loved would never have chosen this." And in that moment, something inside her snapped. A strange protective instinct, a dark and twisted loyalty, rose up in her. "The woman you loved was a naive girl who didn't understand how the world really works," she retorted, her words sharp and cruel. "She thought heroes and villains were easy to tell apart. She was wrong." She saw the deep, uncomprehending hurt in his eyes and knew she had to make the final cut for both their sakes. "Go home, Liam. Marry your fiancé. Be happy. You don't belong here." She turned and walked towards the private elevator, not looking back, each step an affirmation of her choice, a final nail in the coffin of her old life. When the elevator doors opened into the penthouse, Julian was there, standing by the window, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He hadn't needed the security cameras. He could read the violent emotional storm on her face, the tremor in her hands. He said nothing, simply watching her as she stood there, shattered and trembling, the ghost of her past still clinging to her like a shroud. The sight of him calm, powerful, the architect of all this ignited the chaotic cocktail of emotions swirling within her. The guilt over Liam, the white-hot rage at her father, the dizzying confusion of her feelings for the man in front of her. She closed the distance between them, her movements jerky and desperate. She didn't know what she was going to do until she was right in front of him, her hands coming up to fist in the front of his shirt. Then she kissed him. It was not a kiss of tenderness or seduction. It was a kiss of rage, of desperation, of utter surrender. It was a raw, punishing kiss, and he met her force with his own, his arms encircling her, pulling her flesh against him as if he meant to absorb her into himself. He swept her up into his arms and carried her into the bedroom, their mouths never breaking contact. What followed was not lovemaking. It was a storm. It was a violent, frantic exorcism of everything she was feeling. Clothes were torn, skin was marked, and the sounds that filled the room were not of pleasure, but of a desperate, primal claiming. This was not the patient seducer from their wedding night or the gentle comforter from the library. This was the predator, the conqueror, and it was exactly what she needed. She needed him to obliterate the memory of Liam's hurt face, to burn away the lies of her father, to brand her so completely that there was no room for anything else. "Julian," she gasped, her nails digging into the hard muscle of his back, her body arching to meet his every powerful thrust. "Take me. Make me forget." He slowed, looming over her, his face a mask of dark, triumphant possession. He held her gaze, his voice a low, raw command that cut through the chaos. "Tell me you're mine, Alara." This was it. The final question, the final surrender. The past and the present, the lie and the truth, all converged on this single moment. And, with a sob that was equal parts despair and release, she gave him the answer that had been forged in the fire of her discovery and the pain of her final goodbye. "I'm yours, Julian," she cried out, the words a willing confession, a plea, a vow. "I'm yours." He drove into her one last time, and as her world shattered into a million pieces of blinding light, she knew she had not just crossed a line, she had obliterated it. There was no going back. In the aftermath of the storm, a strange and profound quiet settled over their lives. The war within Alara was over, not because she had won, but because she had chosen a side. The final, desperate goodbye to Liam, followed by the violent, possessive claiming by Julian, had been a crucible, burning away the last vestiges of the woman she once was. In her place was someone new, someone harder, clearer, and infinitely more complicated. The resistance was gone, replaced by a cool, pragmatic acceptance. This was her reality now, a landscape of immense wealth, shadowed power, and a partnership with the very man who had orchestrated her downfall. To fight it any longer was to fight her own existence. The shift was palpable in the daily rhythms of the penthouse. The vast spaces that once felt like a prison now simply felt like home. The silence that once screamed of loneliness was now a comfortable quiet, a shared space where she and Julian could exist without the need for pretense. He was no longer just her husband by contract. He was the anchor of her new world, a constant, powerful presence whose thoughts she was beginning to read and whose moods she could anticipate with an almost unnerving accuracy. The nights were no longer an ordeal to be endured, but a dark and complex communion, an arena where their twisted bond was physically reaffirmed, a place of shared secrets and searing, unapologetic pleasure. But acceptance, for a mind like Alara's, could not be a passive state. The endless empty days of a trophy wife were a cage of a different kind, and she refused to be merely decorative. Armed with her education, her intimate knowledge of the Vance Thorne history, and a newfound steely resolve, she began to carve out a territory of her own within Julian's empire. It started small. She began reading the financial reports and industry analyses left on his desk, not out of spying, but out of a genuine, reawakened intellectual hunger. One evening, as he was reviewing a proposal for a new philanthropic initiative for the Thorne Foundation, she pointed out a critical flaw in its distribution model, citing data she had absorbed from a recent article. Julian had looked up from the papers, his dark eyes sharp with surprise, and then with a flicker of something she had never seen before: respect. He listened to her argument, challenged it, and then, after a long, thoughtful silence, conceded the point. "You're right," he had said, a simple admission that felt more significant than any gift he had ever given her. From that day on, she was no longer just Mrs. Thorne, the beautiful appendage. She became a quiet but formidable force within his world. She took an active role in the foundation, her sharp mind and insider's perspective proving invaluable. In public, they were transformed. They became a true power couple, a pair spoken of in the city's elite circles with a mixture of awe and intimidation. He was the ruthless king of industry, and she was his magnificent, fiercely intelligent queen. At glittering galas and high-stakes charity auctions, she moved with a grace and confidence that was entirely her own, her smile beautiful but remote, her eyes missing nothing. She was the perfect partner, anticipating his needs, complementing his strengths, and presenting a united, unbreakable front to the world. Her relationship with her past, however, remained a landscape of ruins. She saw her father once a month for a strained, formal brunch. Vance Industries was stable, chugging along as a profitable but neutered subsidiary of Thorne Corporation. Arthur Vance had his retirement, his golf club membership, his tarnished legacy intact. But he had lost his daughter. He would look at her, seated beside the man he had hated for 2 decades, and a profound, sorrowful bewilderment would cloud his features. They spoke in pleasantries of the weather and the stock market, the colossal, unspoken truths of his betrayal, and her sacrifice, a gaping chasm between them. The fierce, protective love she had once felt for him had curdled into something far more complex, a sad, pitying affection for the weak man she now knew him to be. The transaction was complete, and they were both living with the consequences. The ghost of Liam faded. The sharp, stabbing pain of his memory dulled into a faint, chronic ache, a reminder of a life she might have lived, a person she might have been. She knew he had married, and she wished him a genuine, if distant, happiness. He belonged to the light, to a world of simple truths and uncomplicated love. She had chosen the shadows, and there was no place for him there. One night, after a triumphant evening at a museum benefit, they returned to the quiet of the penthouse. Alara sat at her vanity, the city lights a familiar glittering tapestry behind her, as Julian came up from behind to unclasp the heavy diamond necklace from her neck. His fingers were warm against her cool skin. Their eyes met in the mirror. His expression was, as it so often was, unreadable, but the possessiveness in his gaze was as potent as ever. "You were magnificent tonight," he said, his voice a low murmur. It was not a lover's compliment. It was a CEO's praise for a valuable partner's stellar performance. She did not smile. She simply held his gaze, her own expression, one of placid, sober understanding. In the reflection, she saw them for what they were, 2 powerful, damaged people, bound together not by love, but by a history of betrayal and a shared, insatiable hunger for control. Was it Stockholm Syndrome? A calculated partnership for power and survival? Or had it, over time, twisted itself into a dark, unnameable form of love? Alara no longer knew, or perhaps she no longer cared. The distinctions had ceased to matter. She had lost the life she thought she wanted, but she had survived. She was no longer Alara Vance, the sacrifice. She was Alara Thorne, and in the gilded cage she now called home, she was, at last, learning how to rule. A year passed, then another. The seasons turned outside the great glass walls of the penthouse, the city below shifting with the relentless rhythm of time, but inside, a new and permanent reality had taken root. The life Alara had lost became a distant country, a place she could remember but could no longer imagine visiting. The woman she had been was a photograph of a stranger. Her existence was now entirely defined by the name Thorne, a name she had once despised and now wore as a second skin, a tailored suit of armor and influence. Tonight, she stood before the antique floor-to-ceiling mirror in their bedroom, a silent observer of her own transformation. It was late autumn, and a cool, mournful wind whispered against the windows. She was dressed in a long gown of deep blue velvet, the fabric rich and dark against the pale curve of her skin. But it was the curve of her body itself that held her attention. She was 7 months pregnant, her body swollen with the child, that was both the seal of her bargain and the ultimate symbol of her surrender. She placed a hand on the taut swell of her abdomen, feeling the faint, fluttering kick of the new life within. A life that was half hers and half his. A life that would be born into this gilded cage, a prince to a dark and complicated kingdom. She thought of the girl she had been, the one who had cried in a coffee shop, the one who had stood trembling in a white silk nightgown. That girl had believed in clear lines, in right and wrong, in love and sacrifice. She had sacrificed herself to save a noble father, only to learn that nobility was a lie, and her sacrifice had merely settled an old, dirty debt. That girl was gone, burned away in the fires of truth and the heat of a desire she had never been taught to acknowledge. The woman in the mirror was someone else entirely. Her eyes, once filled with a defiant fire, now held a cool, watchful stillness. She had learned to navigate the treacherous currents of her husband's world, to speak the language of power, to command respect with a quiet word or a calculated smile. She had not been broken by her cage. She had, in a way, become its master. The door opened with a soft click. Julian entered the room, his presence, as always, a subtle shift in the room's gravity. He came to stand behind her, and she did not tense or flinch. She simply watched him in the mirror as he approached, his dark suit a shadow against her deep blue velvet. He placed his hands on her pregnant belly, his long fingers splayed possessively, protectively, over the child they had created. His chin came to rest on her shoulder, his gaze meeting hers in the reflection. For a long moment, they simply stood there, a portrait of a modern dynasty, beautiful, powerful, and built on a foundation of secrets and ruin. He did not speak of love. He had never spoken of love. His words, when they came, were a low, resonant murmur, a statement of ultimate victory. "Our heir," he said, his voice laced with a deep, triumphant satisfaction. The beginning of a new dynasty, built on the ashes of the old. The ashes of her family, she thought, but the observation held no heat, no anger. It was simply a fact. This was the endgame of his 20-year war, the final, perfect revenge. He hadn't just taken his rival's company. He had taken his daughter, his bloodline, and now he had planted his own flag in the future of the Vance name, ensuring it would forever be subsumed by his own. A lesser woman would have been crushed by the weight of it all. A better woman might have fought it to the bitter end. But Alara was no longer either of those things. She leaned back slightly, a subtle gesture of alignment, her body accepting his weight, his claim. Her own hands came up to rest over his. A small, enigmatic smile touched her lips as she looked at their reflection. Outsiders would see a tragedy, the story of a girl sold to a monster, a beautiful bird with broken wings. They would be wrong. The wings were not broken. They had simply grown stronger and learned to fly in a different sky. Julian had sought to purchase a possession, to own the most valuable asset of his enemy. But in his patient, meticulous, and ruthless seduction of her mind and body, he had not simply acquired a wife. He had forged a queen. He thought this child was the culmination of his victory, the symbol of his legacy. But as she felt another strong kick from within, Alara understood something he did not yet see. This child was not just his heir, it was hers. And the story of the Thorn dynasty, the one he believed he was writing, had only just begun.